You know, when I think about the subject of slavery, I think about one of the worst times in our country's history. Wars have been fought over that subject of slavery. People have even lost their lives trying to get out of slavery. And you know, it's spoken of as the epitome of evil in our culture. When we think about slavery, it's seen as a very, very negative thing. Yet, every day, many Americans choose to enter slavery. And the subject that I'm talking to you today about is the Bible tells us that the borrower is slave to the lender. It's about borrowing money and looking at the economy of America today. In our economy, we see that the government continues to borrow money and borrow more money without any thoughts of really how we're going to repay it. And many Americans, the exact same way, they borrow and they borrow with no thought to repay it. Now I realize that's kind of a strong statement. It's not talking about slavery, but the Bible uses that term, how the borrower is slave to the lender. Well, my name is Joseph Alonso, and I'm the children's pastor at the First Baptist Church of Wildwood, and I speak to you today as a pastor and as a Christian counselor, speaking to you of the dangers of borrowing money and the fact that it can be a very, very dangerous thing that you can get into, especially when you have no idea how you're going to repay that money. My purpose in this speech is to persuade you to think before you borrow and to think about the biblical principles of the correct way to borrow money. In this speech, I will discuss 3 different points. And the first point that we'll discuss is the fact of the borrower is slave to the lender. The second point we will discuss is that excess debt is an immoral thing. And thirdly, we'll look at Americans should live within their means. But the first point, the fact that the borrower is slave to the lender. Larry Burkett said that debt is not normal in any economy and shouldn't be normal for God's people, regardless of how right our culture might want it to seem to be. The new normal, what we see in our culture, is the fact that people borrow money. And a lot of times, especially young people, they borrow with no thought of how they're going to repay that money. Dave Ramsey, every day on his show, reminds people of this principle, the fact that the borrower is slave to the lender. And it's very, very difficult to thought of how you're going to repay it. Borrowing takes away the responsibility of God to bless us. And a lot of times I can think of it in my own life where we weren't too sure where our next rent payment was going to come from. But you know what? God has always blessed us. And you know what? Whenever we decide to borrow money, we take away God's ability to bless us in that fact. But secondly, excess debt is immoral. Currently, I heard a study that says currently the 37% of all federal spending comes from borrowing, which means more debt and a veritable fairyland of more magic money created by the feds to service this balloon that was said by Arnold Bach. Financial choices and predicaments are always systematic of other issues that are in a culture. Some of the more common issues that lead to credit card debt includes a lack of contentment, a lack of self-discipline, the search for security, and the search for significance. You know, people like to borrow money just so they can buy things. And the thought is, I was at the store one day with my son, and he asked me for something, a toy, and I told him, I said, well, we can't really afford that right now. And he said, oh, Daddy, just put it on your credit card. And that's the kind of society that we live in today. We live in a society that says, you know what, just put it on the credit card. No clue how I'm going to pay it off. But you know what, just put it on that card because that'll just go, we'll just get what we want right now. It's instant gratification. Well, that's an immoral thought, instant gratification. Because the Bible tells us that we need to work for what we get. And the thing is, it is immoral to think of the fact of just getting something and then not even worrying about how we're going to repay it. But thirdly, Americans should live lives within their means. We live in a debt-ridden society that is now virtually dependent on a constant expansion of credit to keep the economy growing. That is a symptom of a society no longer willing to follow God's discretion, and that was said by Crown Ministry. Living lives of excess and always wanting more is a sign of covetousness and moral decay. It's always about keeping up with the Joneses, or basically what more can we get. And that's kind of the society that we live in today. And Americans, we should learn how to live within our means. You know, 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago, when we looked at the principles of our grandparents, they saved money. And they saved to buy things like their houses and things that they wanted. They didn't just go out and put it on a credit card. And that is the moral way to live lives, is to live within our means and not to live in excess of what our means are. But in this speech, we looked at the fact that persons should think before they borrow. And they should decide if it's God's will first. And there are some things, of course, that we have to borrow for. And you think of like mortgages and homes. And there are some times where money has to be borrowed to be able to purchase something that we need. But that's not the society that we live in today. The main points that we looked at here is the fact that the borrower is a slave to the lender. We also looked that excess debt is immoral, and that Americans should live within the means that God has given us. So the call to action that I give to you is to think before you borrow. To think if it's a good investment. To think if this is what you need and not just what you want. We don't want to live lives as slaves to the lender. We want to live free lives so that we can allow God to bless us, but so that also one day we can even be a blessing to someone else. Thank you very much for your time.